Hello, dear listener, and welcome to tonight's journey through the shadows of history. If you enjoy stories like these, please remember to give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. It truly helps keep these stories alive. And I would love to know, where in the world are you listening from right now? Tell me in the comments so we can see how far our little community reaches. Now, let us begin. For the tale we explore tonight is not one of fairy tale queens in shining palaces, but of women who wore crowns in an age when power was both blessing and curse, when influence could be as deadly as poison, and when a queen's beauty, wit, or ambition could turn her into prey. In the tapestry of Europe's long history, queens have been painted as symbols of grace, elegance, and stability. Yet behind the embroidered curtains, their lives were often perilous games of survival. The throne was not simply a seat of honor, it was a stage, and every word, gesture, and alliance was scrutinized by eyes both loyal and treacherous. In the courts of the Middle Ages and even earlier, a queen's power was never absolute. Her position was bound to the favor of her husband, the approval of the nobility, and the shifting winds of politics. And while kings fought wars and forged treaties, queens navigated an entirely different battlefield, one fought with whispers, poisoned cups, forged letters, and the silent turning of allies into enemies. Ancient Europe was not a single realm, but a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and principalities, each with its own rules, ambitions, and rivalries. In some lands, queens wielded considerable influence. In others, they were little more than symbolic ornaments. But in all, the same danger lingered. The higher you rose, the farther you could fall, and the swifter the drop if someone decided you were a threat. The reasons queens were hunted were rarely simple. Sometimes it was jealousy, a rival noblewoman, a scorned mistress, or even another queen consort could set the court ablaze with rumor. Sometimes it was politics, an alliance gone sour, a treaty broken, a foreign bride who was never truly accepted. And sometimes it was superstition. In an age when omens and prophecies carried weight, a queen's misstep could be painted as witchcraft, her counsel as manipulation by dark forces. To understand why these women were hunted, we must step into the courts where marble floors were as slippery as ice, where a smile could mask a dagger's intent, and where the very walls seemed to listen. Imagine the flicker of torchlight in a great hall, the rustle of silk gowns, the measured steps of guards in polished armor. Every glance was calculated, every laugh rehearsed, every feast a test. For a queen, there was no such thing as a private moment. Even the royal chambers were not safe. Handmaidens could be bribed, confidants could be turned, and the bedchamber itself could become a trap. In ancient Europe, power was not inherited without challenge. Many queens were foreign-born, married into distant courts where the language, customs, and loyalties were unfamiliar. They entered as strangers and were expected to produce heirs, maintain alliances, and charm subjects who often saw them as outsiders. Failure in any of these could be fatal. History offers countless examples: queens accused of adultery to remove them from power, queens poisoned during feasts, queens imprisoned in towers or convents under charges so thin they could barely hold their own weight. In the chronicles, their downfalls are often reduced to a line or two, but behind each was a storm of intrigue, betrayal, and fear. And unlike soldiers who could defend themselves with steel, queens fought in silence. Their weapons, words, and influence, their armor, the careful control of every public gesture. Tonight, we will walk alongside these women. We will see the games they were forced to play, the dangers they could never escape, and the fates that awaited those who lost. This is not a tale of one queen, but of many, a woven history of power and peril, where the crown was as much a target as it was a prize. The candlelight is low now, the court is quiet, and in this stillness, the truth can be told, the shocking truth of why queens in ancient Europe were hunted, not only by their enemies, but sometimes by those they loved and trusted most. Power in ancient Europe did not move like a river with a single course. It pooled and seeped and flooded according to season and will, and queens lived where those waters met, where currents collided in secrecy and spectacle, and that is why they were hunted. Because the place between powers is the place everyone covets and fears at once. The narrow isthmus that armies cross and storms batter, and on that strip stood a woman whose breath could steady a kingdom or set it trembling. A queen's danger began the moment her marriage was inked in wax and wine. For royal unions were not romance's boo-tea treaties with hands, and each hand that clasped hers laid claim not only to her person but to the inner rooms of state, to the cradle and the council table alike. She arrived in a court as a foreign tide, bearing another language, another network, another expectation, and the old families of her new land watched with narrowed eyes, measuring how quickly she would plant roots and whether those roots would wrap around their privileges. The first hunt often wore the mask of courtesy, a procession of gifts and smiles that concealed an inventory of her vulnerabilities. Could she read the balance of factions? Did she favor certain chaplains? Did she share secrets with her ladies? Did she write letters to old companions? Did she prefer one tutor for a young prince over another? Each preference a boundary stone placed in a field already claimed, and so a rumor might be tested like a gate, gently at first, a whisper that the new queen was too pious or not pious enough, too proud or not proud enough, and when that rumor met no resistance, it returned, sharpened, that she spent too much time in the chapel with a certain confessor, that she laughed too easily at the jests of a captain, that she hoarded coin for her dowry city, that she sent messages across the border by coded hands. In a court of polished floors, even soft steps leave marks, and women in crown and veil learned to walk without noise, while knowing each footfall was counted by those who wished them to slip. Fertility was the sharpest blade held to a queen's throat, because the future of a dynasty sat in a cradle, and a cradle is the most public-private thing in the world. The months of waiting bound the whole realm to her body, to the recounting of midwives, to the reading of omens in the way she turned her head at supper, to the prayers of parishes that had never seen her face. A miscarriage invited physicians and theologians alike to speak as if they had walked her dreams, to search her linens for meaning and her diet for fault, to say the air in her apartments was wrong, or the saints she favored were wrong, or the night she and her husband chose was wrong. And if the years stretched long without an heir, the court began to grow a second court in the shadows, a party that smiled in hallways and counted candles in chapels while adding names to the list of those who might replace her. For the line between pity and policy is thin where crowns are concerned. Regency transformed the hunt into a sharper sport. For when kings died young or rode to distant wars, queens were invited to sit as guardians over sons too small to bear swords, and that invitation came with a dagger hidden in the scroll, because a child's crown gathers the ambitions of every noble who believes he hears a louder calling from God. The mother who sealed decrees for her son was called wise on Monday, proud on Tuesday, manipulative on Wednesday. And on Thursday, the city gates were weighed in case a cousin arrived with soldiers. To hold a kingdom together with lullabies and tax ledgers is a labor without applause. And yet, if famine thinned the bread or snow broke the bridges, or a border lord tested the watchfires, the regent was marked for it. For the world prefers to hang its misfortune on a single hook, and the queen's silhouette is easiest to find in torchlight. Religion wrapped the hunt in holiness, for doctrine gives daggers prayers, and a queen's confession colored every act she performed. In one realm, a devotion to relics made her sanctified, in another it made her suspect, and the men who wrote sermons could stir a city with ink, insisting that a woman who influenced the royal conscience imperiled the realm's soul. Where altars divided Europe into rival lights, a queen's accent could be a scandal, her chaplain a conspiracy, her household hymns a threat to the nation's covenant, and so processions of piety might be met with processions of protest, each candle answered by a cudgel, and in the din a letter would be produced from a drawer, a confession forged or coaxed, a seal pressed crooked in wax, and waved above a crowd that had never seen her face except on coins. The household itself was a chessboard, and queens moved within it like queens on marble, powerful in lines others could not take but vulnerable to the fork and pin of servants and stewards and steely-eyed widows who had survived 3 reigns by smiling at the right hour. A bedchamber is never empty. It gathers a court of hands and eyes, chamberers, laundresses, scribes, tutors, confessors, physicians, each with kin outside the palace and loyalties that change with the tides. And to hunt a queen, one first courts her keepers, the woman who folds her nightgown, the boy who bears her fruit, the guard who warms his hands by her fire, and from those small doors come the large accusations. That the queen tore a letter and wept at midnight, that she burned a lock of hair in a brazier, that she refused wine poured by a certain lord and smiled at another's jape, that she walked on the east terrace when she said she would walk on the west. Accusation loves specifics, and specifics breed certainty in minds that long to be free of doubt. The law stood like a stone in the river, and queens learned how it could be walked around. For statutes written to bar women from succession could still be wielded to bar them from safety. Clauses about adultery, about betrayal of counsel, about meddling in succession, about moving coin without the treasurer's mark, about accepting gifts from foreign princes, about appointing clerks in defiance of custom. Each article an oar in the hands of men who wanted the boat to turn, and once a charge was found it was read in public so that shame could do what swords hesitated to finish. Yet the greatest prosecutions began not in court but at supper, when a toast was raised and someone did not drink, when a platter bore 2 slices missing instead of 1, when a cup was set down too quickly, when a taster coughed, and the hall suddenly felt very small. Poison is a rumor with a metal taste, and queens swallowed both with care. Foreign policy made a queen a bridge and a breach, for she was the living treaty between 2 houses. And when tribute ran late or captains quarreled in the fog, her letters were weighed like gold dust to see which way the wind would blow. If her birth family prospered, she was called a conduit for their greed. If they suffered, she was called a liability, and thus she was hunted both for loyalty and for lack of it, a paradox that tightened like a noose woven from opposite ends of a rope. Embassies watched her curtains. Ambassadors counted her smiles. Courtiers, dressmakers, and falconers traded glances as they passed one another in corridors. And in that relay of significance, a frown at a tapestry could become a policy shift by nightfall. The oldest engines of peril were envy and legacy, 2 horses that pull the same chariot at different speeds. Queens carried pearls and stories, and sometimes the story shone more dangerously than the pearl. The legend of a woman who steered a treaty from ruin or stared down a mutiny in the nursery frightened men who preferred their power to arrive without witnesses, so they painted her with darker colors, adding spices of seduction and whispers of sorcery. For the easiest way to unmake a woman's achievements is to enchant them backward, to say the success came from a sin, and then to punish the sin while pocketing the success. Even within the council chamber, the hunt was quiet and patient. The long table where maps were unrolled became a stage where a queen's suggestions were measured against male egos sharpened by steel, and if her advice proved sound, certain men remembered it as their own, and if disaster still arrived, her words were replayed as confession. The minutes of council are made of ink, and ink obeys the hand that holds the quill. But do not imagine these women as only pursued. They learned the venery of survival in courts where hounds do not bark, but bow. They cultivated circles that overlapped without aligning. They paid stipends to the overlooked who see everything. They kept 2 ledgers, one of coin and one of favors. They gave gifts that could be worn in public and used in private. Knives that cut fruit and paper both. Lockets with saints and keys. Shoes that tapped warnings on certain tiles, and above all, they mastered the art of time, for the true currency of a palace is not gold, but an hour bought, a petition delayed, a wedding advanced, a hunt called off for rain. To live was to move the calendar more than the chess pieces, because a tide that is not yet at the pier cannot drown you. Yet pregnancy returned as the eternal referendum on a queen's right to breathe. For when the swaddling clothes were brought to air in the courtyard, all of Europe seemed to inhale, and if the infant cried strong, alliances thickened like cream. But if the cradle lay still, the court stood very still as well, listening for the sound of the next whisper. And in that kind of silence, a name becomes a verdict. Midwives were interrogated like spies. Astrologers recalculated as if the stars had erred. Confessions were pried from frightened mouths. And amid the perfumed shudders, the queen learned that grief is never private for a woman whose sorrow can double as a rival's ladder. The hunt could end in a dozen ways. A convent whose walls sang with bees and regret. A castle whose windows faced a courtyard and nothing beyond. A barge under guard drifting to a fortress where the keys were kept by a man who would not meet her eyes. A public square arranged for eloquence and rope. A chalice that smelled slightly of almonds. A treaty that required her to walk out between two soldiers and look back only once. And even exile had its snares, for a queen removed from one court becomes an instrument in another, a flag unfurled by foreign hands. Her very breathing converted into a message across mountains. Why were queens hunted in ancient Europe, you ask? And the answer is both vast and intimate. Because the crown is a ring and rings attract fingers. Because the state is a roof and roofs attract storms. Because a woman who sits at the center of a family and a realm becomes the place where memory and ambition collide. And when men fear memory and covet ambition, they call it duty to unseat her. But also because people love stories, and a queen is the brightest character on the stage. And when the audience is hungry, or cold, or angry, they demand a plot with blood, and the playwrights of policy oblige. And yet, despite the snares, the chronicles keep turning up the same stubborn detail, that queens learn to write themselves into margins where censors seldom look, into letters with gentler ink, into foundations whose bells outlived the bellies that begrudged them, into tapestries whose borders told truths the center dared not speak. Hunted though they were, they left tracks not of desperation but of design. And if you listen, if you press your ear to the doors they once passed, you can still hear the quiet recital of their arithmetic. How many allies for one enemy? How many candles for one dark corridor? How many miles for one safe harbor? How many lullabies for one counsel? And above all, how many breaths for one more morning? Because survival in a palace was never a single act. It was a discipline learned between the clang of goblets and the scratch of quills, and that is why their stories endure, not in triumphal arches, but in the polished edges of a life that refused to shatter even while being aimed at. And in the next part, we will step closer to the rooms where the hunts were planned, to the private chapels where politics wore a halo, to the counting rooms where dowries were sharpened into knives, and to the nurseries where the softest hands held the hardest futures. The planning of a queen's downfall rarely began with a shout, it began with a supper. The candles would be arranged so that certain faces were in shadow, certain smiles caught in the light. A toast might be raised to the health of the king, but eyes would flicker toward the woman seated beside him, measuring how much she drank, whether she glanced at the cup before it touched her lips. This was the theater where hunts were seated not on the battlefield, but at the banquet table, where words could be dressed as compliments and still cut to the bone. Courtiers learned to use laughter as a blade, to let jokes travel across the hall until the target could not tell if she was meant to laugh along or understand the warning hidden in the punchline. Every gesture became a possible signal, the dropping of a napkin, the late arrival to the feast, the refusal of a dish, said to be a delicacy from her homeland. These things would be recorded in minds like ledger entries, each one a small weight in the scales of suspicion. In the private chapels, where kings knelt for blessings, politics took on the appearance of piety. Queens knew that kneeling beside their husbands was not simply devotion, it was performance. The choice of which saint's relic to kiss, which hymn to hum, could send ripples through factions in the court. Priests and confessors were more than spiritual guides, they were conduits of influence. each with the ability to shape the king's conscience in ways the queen could not control. And if her devotion aligned too closely with the interests of a foreign power or a rival bishop, whispers of heresy could begin as softly as the shuffle of feet on stone floors. In an age where faith and law were woven into the same cloth, a single accusation of impiety could fray a queen's standing faster than any political misstep. The counting rooms were another battlefield, quieter but no less dangerous. Here, dowries became weapons, their gold flowing in streams that could nourish or starve entire factions. A queen whose dowry lands produced rich harvests held leverage. She could direct grain toward cities loyal to her or withhold it in times of unrest. But these same riches painted a target on her back. Ministers of finance could comb through her accounts, searching for irregularities that could be reinterpreted as treason. A gift to a loyal lady-in-waiting could be recast as bribery, a loan to a merchant ally as a conspiracy. Even the simple act of ordering new tapestries might be twisted into a sign of arrogance, proof she sought to rival the king's own splendor. Nurseries, too, became war rooms. The cradle was both sanctuary and throne, and the women who served their governesses, wet nurses, tutors could determine the political leanings of the next ruler long before the child learned to walk. If the queen spent too much time in the nursery, she might be accused of hiding there to avoid matters of state. If she spent too little time, she risked appearing cold and detached. Rival factions would try to place their own people in these intimate spaces, ensuring that the child would grow to trust their voices more than his mother's. A misplaced word, a bedtime story with too much moral weight, could plant seeds that would blossom years later into distrust or defiance. But the most dangerous ground of all was the queen's own household. Here, alliances were formed in the corridors over whispered conversations between servants. Chambermaids might serve both their mistress and the ambitions of those outside the palace, carrying gossip in and out like folded linens. Guards might be bribed to leave a door unlatched, or to listen too closely to private discussions. Even small betrayals could be catastrophic. A misplaced letter, a servant who accidentally repeated a confidence, a physician who reported her ailments to the wrong ears. The queen's safety depended on loyalty that could be bought or broken in a single night. And yet, queens adapted. They became masters of the long game, learning to speak in layers, one meaning for the room, another for the listener they truly intended to reach. They placed small debts in the pockets of men too proud to notice, debts they could call upon when needed. They hosted entertainments that mixed friends and enemies so skillfully that neither could tell the difference until the night was over. They kept secrets not in locked chests, but in plain sight, disguised as harmless trifles. The hunt for a queen in ancient Europe was not merely about removing her from power, it was about erasing her entirely, making her name a cautionary tale rather than a legacy. This is why so many of their stories have come down to us in fragments, pieces torn from larger lives. Yet even in the ruins of their reputations, traces of their strategies remain, hints of women who understood that survival was not about avoiding the hunt, but about shaping it to their advantage for as long as possible. In the next part, we will follow these hunts to their turning points, the moments when private plots became public crises, when the web tightened and escape required more than cunning. This is where the true measure of a queen's resilience was tested, and where the difference between survival and ruin could hinge on a single night. Power in ancient Europe was never static, and for a queen, it was as much a weapon as it was a target painted on her back. Her crown did not rest lightly. It was a visible declaration that she stood at the intersection of politics, lineage, and the ambitions of men who could not wear that crown themselves. From the moment she entered the court, whether by birth or marriage, she was a living emblem of alliances, a bridge between kingdoms or noble houses, and that made her invaluable but also expendable. The very marriage that secured peace could later be reinterpreted as the cause of unrest. The same vows that once bound nations could be painted as shackles holding them back. It was a precarious existence, where the smiles she wore at a feast might conceal a mind calculating which of her so-called allies would still be loyal in a month. The architecture of royal life gave her little space to breathe. The great halls, echoing with chatter and the shuffle of slippered feet, were arenas as much as the battlefield outside the castle walls. She walked under the gaze of courtiers who measured her every step, recorded her every glance. A glance too long at a favored nobleman could be spun into an affair. A moment of weariness mistaken for disdain could stir resentment in those whose loyalty was already thin. The air itself in those halls was heavy with intrigue, scented with incense and perfumed bodies, but underneath it, the acrid tang of competition lingered, an unspoken reminder that here, trust was ever unconditional. The queen's household was both sanctuary and snare. Every chambermaid, every cook, every guard bore witness to fragments of her life, and fragments could be pieced together into a story she never intended to tell. In a world where letters could be intercepted, where even a whispered prayer might be overheard, secrecy was an art form. Queens learned to master it, embedding truth within harmless anecdotes, conveying intent in the tilt of a head or the choice of a gown. They learned to use the languages of the court, not just French, Latin, or their native tongue, but the more dangerous dialect of implication. But such skill could not shield them from the machinations that turned slowly, inexorably, toward their undoing. The court itself thrived on spectacle, and the downfall of a queen made for a performance like no other. Her enemies did not always strike openly. They cultivated doubt in the minds of those closest to the king. It could begin with an offhand comment about her spending, a suggestion that her tastes leaned too heavily toward foreign luxuries, as though her heart were still tethered to another land. It could be a rumor that she met too often with her ladies in private chambers, as if those meetings concealed sedition instead of embroidery and gossip. And once suspicion took root, it grew with alarming speed. Those who hunted queens rarely acted alone. Factions formed quietly, bound not by loyalty to one another, but by a shared goal to see her influence stripped, her voice silenced. Some sought revenge for perceived slights. Others coveted the positions her fall would vacate. The motivations varied, but the method was often the same: isolate her, strip her of allies one by one, and make her appear dangerous enough to warrant removal, while powerless enough to ensure she could not fight back. Outside the palace walls, the people's opinion could be manipulated with equal ease. Pamphlets might circulate, painting her as wasteful, as corrupt, as foreign in ways that made her suspect. Ballads could be sung in taverns, their verses dripping with insinuations that blurred the line between truth and invention. In a time when most could not read, these spoken and sung narratives carried immense weight, shaping public sentiment more effectively than any written decree. Yet for all this danger, queens were not passive prey. They learned to counter rumors with carefully staged appearances, to reinforce their image through acts of piety, charity, and calculated humility. They would be seen visiting churches in simple dress, speaking to the poor, kissing the heads of sick children, all while ensuring these moments were witnessed by the right eyes and reported in the right circles. Such displays could buy them time, and time was often the most precious commodity in a hunt. But time could also be a trap. The longer a queen held her ground, the more desperate her enemies became, and desperation bred boldness. In the next part, we will see how these hunts shifted from whispered conspiracies into overt challenges, when the shadows in the corridors gave way to accusations hurled in full light, and the queen's survival depended not just on political skill, but on the unpredictable favor of the king himself. When the quiet whispers of the court transformed into open confrontation, a queen found herself walking a razor's edge between dignity and defiance. The hunt no longer existed solely in candlelit corners or behind closed doors. It spilled into council chambers, banquets, and even into the king's presence. The accusations, once veiled in polite suggestion, became sharper, designed to wound in public and weaken her standing with every word. In such moments, the queen's face became her shield. She could not afford to show anger, for it would be read as guilt. Nor could she show fear, for it would be seen as weakness. Instead, she cultivated the expression of serene composure, a mask that betrayed nothing while her mind worked furiously to anticipate the next blow. Those who hunted her understood that perception could be more lethal than proof. If enough members of the court believed her to be untrustworthy, the king would be forced to distance himself, if only to preserve his own authority. The queen's position, once thought untouchable, was sustained not by law but by the fragile balance of loyalty, affection, and political convenience. Should any of these falter, her enemies would press their advantage without hesitation. It was not uncommon for charges against a queen to be framed in moral terms, appealing to the religious sensibilities of the realm. She might be accused of impiety, of neglecting her duties to the church, or even of consorting with those branded as heretics. Such allegations could be devastating, for they struck at the heart of a queen's public role as a moral example to her people. More dangerous still were claims that touched the sanctity of the royal bloodline. Accusation of adultery, however unfounded, could justify the annulment of her marriage and the disinheritance of her children. Even if these claims were never proven, the stain upon her reputation could linger, weakening her influence in ways that could not easily be undone. The mechanisms of these hunts were as varied as they were relentless. A queen might find her household staff replaced by those loyal to her rivals, cutting her off from information and limiting her ability to act. Trusted confidantes could be bribed or coerced into betraying her secrets. Ambassadors from foreign courts might receive altered reports of her words and actions, poisoning the alliances she relied upon. Every gesture was scrutinized, every word dissected for meanings she had not intended. In such a climate, even the smallest misstep could be magnified into treachery. Yet amidst these pressures, a queen could still turn the tide in her favor, but only if she could master the art of counterattack, without appearing to do so. This required a delicate dance, where every move had to be cloaked in the language of loyalty and service. She might arrange for her allies to promote favorable stories of her virtue and devotion, or subtly redirect suspicion toward those who posed the greatest threat to her. Some queens took greater risks, forging secret alliances with disgruntled nobles, or even reaching out to factions previously hostile to them, united by a common enemy. However, these maneuvers carried their own dangers. An alliance born of desperation could unravel quickly if fortune shifted, and those who once stood beside her might turn on her in the hope of securing their own survival. As the pressure mounted, the hunt became not just a struggle for political survival, but a personal trial that tested every facet of her resolve. She learned to sleep lightly, for danger could come in the form of a midnight arrest as easily as a public decree. She learned to guard her health, for illness could be both a weapon wielded by her enemies and a weakness exploited by those who wished her gone. And most of all, she learned that trust, once lost, was rarely regained even from those who had once sworn unwavering loyalty. By the time the hunt reached its final stage, the queen's fate often rested on a single point: the king's willingness to defend her. In the next part, we will explore the moments when that defense faltered, when the weight of political necessity outweighed the bonds of marriage, and when the queen's crown became the very proof of her guilt. The moment when a queen realized that the king's protection was slipping away was often subtle, almost imperceptible to those beyond the inner circle of the court. Yet to her it was as clear and cold as the tolling of a funeral bell. It might begin with a delay in answering her letters, or with his absence from her chambers under the pretense of pressing affairs of state. Soon, the gestures of public unity, walking side by side during ceremonies, exchanging glances across the hall, would become rare, replaced by carefully measured distance that everyone could see. This gradual erosion of visible support was not accidental. It was a calculated signal to the nobility, to foreign ambassadors, and to the queen's enemies that her position was no longer secure. The king, bound by the constant balancing act of alliances and political pressures, could not always afford to defend her without risking his own authority. If powerful factions within the realm demanded her removal, he might find it expedient to yield, even if it meant betraying his vows. Sometimes the decision was made for him, orchestrated by a coalition of courtiers who had already planned her downfall, presenting it as an unavoidable necessity to preserve the stability of the kingdom. The final phase of the hunt was both swift and merciless. A formal accusation might be read aloud before the court, stripping the queen of her titles, honors, and influence in a matter of moments. In some cases, she would be confined to her chambers, her movements restricted, her servants replaced by guards whose loyalty lay elsewhere. At other times, she might be sent to a distant estate under the guise of rest or religious retreat, never to return. For those accused of the gravest crimes, treason, heresy, adultery, the end could be far harsher, culminating in trial and execution, the spectacle serving as both punishment and warning. Even in exile or imprisonment, the queen's existence remained a danger to those who had orchestrated her fall. As long as she lived, there was always the possibility of her return, should the political winds shift in her favor. This fear often led her enemies to ensure her complete removal from the stage, sometimes through discreet arrangements that left no trace, sometimes through highly public ends that cemented her infamy in the annals of history. Yet not all queens met such fates without resistance. Some used their final day to rally supporters, sending secret messages to allies in the hope of sparking a reversal. Others chose defiance, facing their accusers with words so sharp they lingered long after her body was gone. In rare instances, the queen's fall backfired upon her enemies, uniting the people in outrage and forcing the king to restore her, at least in title if not in power. Still, these were exceptions. More often, the hunt for a queen ended in silence, her name gradually erased from the chronicles or reduced to a cautionary tale about ambition, pride, or the perils of a woman's influence. In truth, the reasons behind these hunts were rarely as simple as the charges suggested. They were the product of a volatile intersection of politics, personal rivalry, and the unspoken fear of a woman whose presence could sway the course of a kingdom. To understand why queens were hunted, one must accept that in the courts of ancient Europe, power was never static. It shifted like the tides, and those who stood at its center, even a crowned queen, could be swept away without warning. In the next chapter, we will move beyond the court walls to see how the people of the realm perceived these hunts, and how the image of a queen, whether saintly or scandalous, could shape the fate of the monarchy itself. Outside the gilded halls of palaces and the whispered intrigues of council chambers, the common people of ancient Europe observed the rise and fall of queens with a mixture of fascination, fear, and suspicion. News of a queen's disgrace spread quickly, carried by merchants along trade routes, murmured by travelers at roadside inns, and retold in the bustling markets where gossip was as valuable a commodity as grain or cloth. To the villagers and townsfolk, a queen was not merely a distant figure draped in jewels. She was a symbol, a living embodiment of the crown's legitimacy and fortune. When she flourished, it was taken as a sign that the realm was stable, blessed, and protected by divine favor. When she fell, it was often interpreted as an omen that the kingdom itself was in decline, or that the wrath of God was close at hand. Church sermons sometimes fueled this perception, subtly weaving her alleged crimes into moral lessons about vanity, disobedience, or the dangers of a woman stepping beyond her ordained role. For peasants whose lives were governed by strict hierarchies and unyielding traditions, the spectacle of a queen's public shaming confirmed what they had been taught, that even the highest-born woman could not escape the consequences of straying from the path laid out for her. Yet there was also a current of unease that accompanied such events. The public nature of a queen's downfall was both a warning and a reminder of the fragility of status. If a woman crowned and blessed in a sacred ceremony could be cast down so swiftly, what protection did anyone else have? This sentiment sometimes gave rise to quiet sympathy, especially among women who saw in the queen's plight a reflection of their own struggles, battles fought not with armies or politics, but with the constant weight of expectations, the watchful eyes of neighbors, and the unforgiving judgment of their communities. In taverns and around hearth fires, alternative versions of the official story would take shape. Perhaps the queen was not guilty at all, they would say, but the victim of jealous rivals or an ambitious mistress seeking to replace her. These whispered narratives, while rarely recorded in official chronicles, carried their own power, shaping the legacy of queens long after their fates were sealed. Ballads were sometimes composed in their honor, transforming them into tragic heroines whose beauty and virtue had been undone by treachery. In other cases, crude songs mocked them, turning their downfall into a source of coarse humor that reinforced the official condemnation. The people's response could be unpredictable, and those in power understood the danger of allowing sympathy for a fallen queen to grow unchecked. This is why, in many cases, the crown sought to control the narrative from the very beginning, ensuring that every town crier, every herald, every official decree told the same version of events. The image of the queen as a dangerous influence, a disruptive force, or a sinful woman was carefully cultivated to prevent dissent. Still, there were moments when the control slipped, when the sight of a queen being led through the streets head high despite her chains stirred something deep in the hearts of those who watched. Whether it was pity, admiration, or quiet rage, it was dangerous enough to unsettle the ruling powers. In the next section, we will explore how these public perceptions, both controlled and uncontrolled, influenced not just the fate of individual queens, but the stability of entire dynasties. When a queen's position began to falter, the ripple of consequences moved far beyond the palace walls, touching every layer of society in ways both visible and invisible. For nobles, the fall of a queen often meant a shift in influence, the loss of alliances painstakingly forged through marriage, or the sudden rise of a rival faction whose fortunes were tied to her downfall. These lords and ladies understood that in the high game of power, proximity to a disgraced queen could be as dangerous as open rebellion, and so many were quick to distance themselves, offering public displays of loyalty to the king, while quietly erasing any signs of past allegiance to her. Old letters were burned, gifts returned or destroyed, and servants who had once attended the queen were reassigned to other households. Merchants and tradesmen who had profited from her patronage, jewelers, dressmakers, perfumers found their livelihoods disrupted overnight, their work suddenly considered tainted by association. Even the clergy, who might have once lauded her piety or celebrated her charitable works, could swiftly rewrite their sermons, painting her virtues as masks for ambition or deceit. In such an atmosphere, fear was as potent a weapon as any sword. The message was clear. If the most exalted woman in the realm could be brought low, then no one's position was truly secure. This climate of fear was precisely what the ruling powers wanted, for it discouraged open resistance and made examples of those who dared step outside the prescribed boundaries. And yet, beneath this surface compliance, there often lingered a quiet resistance. Some of the queen's former allies would work in the shadows to protect her smuggling letters, relaying news of her children, or even helping her escape if the opportunity arose. These acts of loyalty, though rare, reveal the complexity of political life in ancient Europe, where personal bonds could sometimes outweigh the cold calculus of survival. The danger was not only political, but deeply symbolic. Queens embodied an ideal of feminine power that was both alluring and unsettling to the patriarchal order. Their visibility, their ability to influence decisions, and their symbolic link to the prosperity of the kingdom all made them figures to be controlled, feared, or destroyed. And when a queen was accused of infidelity, treachery, or witchcraft, the charges carried more than legal weight. They became moral indictments that shaped public perception for generations. Chroniclers, often working under the patronage of the crown, would carefully select details that reinforced the image of the queen as a cautionary tale. Her ambitions would be exaggerated, her friendships with foreign envoys recast as conspiracies, her charitable donations reframed as bribes. In the pages of these records, she ceased to be a human being and became a symbol of what happened when a woman overstepped the boundaries imposed upon her. For some queens, their fates ended in quiet confinement. Hidden away in remote castles or convents, their names gradually fading from the public mind. Others met a far more public and violent end, executed before a crowd that was told to see justice, even if what they truly witnessed was the raw demonstration of power. It was in these moments that the theater of monarchy revealed itself most clearly. The rituals, the proclamations, the staged confessions or defiant silences, all carefully designed to send a message that would echo far beyond the queen's final breath. And as that message spread, it reinforced the unspoken truth that in the world of ancient European courts, being queen was not merely an honor, but a role balanced on the edge of a blade, and that blade was always ready to fall. The court had grown quieter over the past months, not because peace had been achieved, but because fear had taken root so deeply that even whispers risked drawing the wrong ears. In the grand halls where queens once walked with measured grace, every step now felt like crossing a battlefield unseen. The tapestries still depicted glorious hunts, noble banquets, and the union of kingdoms through marriage. But the reality beneath the embroidery was far darker. Queens were hunted not with arrows or spears, but with letters sealed in wax, with forged accusations, with alliances forged overnight and broken before morning. The hunt began long before any public scandal. It began in rooms lit only by a single candle, where a trusted servant reported a private word, or a spurned courtier recalled a glance that could be reinterpreted as treason. The machinery of suspicion moved slowly at first, like a wheel turning in thick mud. But once set in motion, it gathered speed and weight until no one could stop it. A queen in ancient Europe could be condemned without trial, simply because her existence threatened the fragile balance of power between noble houses. If she bore no heir, she was a liability. If she bore too many sons, she was a danger to succession. If she spoke too much, she was ambitious. If she spoke too little, she was hiding something. Every possible action and inaction could be reframed into guilt. In the chronicles, these events were often reduced to neat lines. The queen fell from favor. She was accused of witchcraft. She died unexpectedly. But behind those lines was a slow suffocation. Servants would be dismissed and replaced with informants. Personal letters would vanish and reappear altered. Even her clothing might be tampered with, jewels removed or replaced with lesser stones to imply her fall from the king's grace. Some queens resisted, writing their own narratives in diaries hidden behind false walls, knowing they would never survive but hoping that someday someone would read the truth. Others tried to fight through diplomacy, aligning themselves with foreign envoys, offering concessions to powerful families, or even bargaining with the church to declare their marriages sacred and untouchable. But the church itself could be a hunter. A queen who failed to align her piety with political convenience might find sermons hinting at her sins, priests refusing her the sacraments, and pilgrims gossiping about her visions as evidence of demonic influence. The most terrifying aspect was how public perception could be turned in days. One week the people might cheer her from the palace gates, praising her beauty and charity, and the next they would spit as she passed. Convinced she had plotted against their beloved monarch, rumors traveled faster than any royal decree. And once the idea of guilt had settled in the public mind, innocence became irrelevant. In such a climate, a queen could not rest, even in her private chambers. Every glance from a maid might be loaded with meaning. Every delayed meal might be feared as poison. Even the king's affection, if it came suddenly, might be suspected as a final gesture before condemnation. The hunt was psychological warfare, wearing her down until she appeared weak and unfit to rule by the king's side, thus justifying her removal. And when the end came, it was rarely swift. Some were sent quietly to distant convents under the guise of retirement, their names stricken from records, their portraits removed from galleries. Others faced public trials, where the outcome was decided long before the charges were read, the spectacle serving as both entertainment and warning. In those moments, the crowd did not see a queen stripped of her dignity. They saw a predator caught, a danger removed, because that is what they had been taught to see. Yet among the noble women and ladies-in-waiting who watched, there were always some who recognized the pattern, who knew that the next queen would be hunted just the same. In that recognition lay the bitter truth. In ancient Europe, queenship was not a crown of power, but a mark on the back, a target painted in gold and silk. If you were a queen in ancient Europe, your throne was never just a seat of power. it was a gilded cage, a constant performance in a world where loyalty shifted with the wind, and your very survival depended on whether you could read the hearts of men before they read the weakness in yours. The crown you wore might have been studded with jewels, but each gem was a reminder of the battles fought to place it on your head. Battles that left scars on the land, on your people, and most dangerously, on your reputation. For in these courts, whispers could weigh more than armies, and the wrong rumor could topple a monarch faster than any invading force. A queen's position was both exalted and perilous, a balance of grace and vigilance where one misstep could send you tumbling from the dais to the dungeon. The idea of hunting queens was rarely spoken of in direct words, yet it existed like a shadow over every royal woman, a silent agreement among those in power that if a queen ever threatened the delicate equilibrium of alliances, her removal, whether through scandal, annulment, or execution, would be justified in the name of stability. This unspoken threat thrived because queens were symbols, and symbols were dangerous. They could inspire loyalty or rebellion, depending on who told their story. In the great halls where politics played out like theater, your every glance, your choice of words, even the cut of your gown could be interpreted as a statement. And in a time when alliances were fragile, a statement could be deadly. You were expected to be the perfect embodiment of your realm's virtues, but those virtues were defined by the men who held the reins of power, and they could shift without warning. A queen who was lauded for her strength one year could be condemned for her arrogance the next. A queen praised for her fertility could become an inconvenience if she bore no sons, or if the sons she bore threatened the wrong line of succession. And so you lived in a constant state of guarded performance, never certain which version of yourself would be deemed acceptable tomorrow. Behind the grandeur of processions and banquets lay a world of coded messages, gifts that were not mere tokens but political statements, and conversations laced with subtext that could decide your fate long before you realized you were in danger. Courtiers and ambassadors spoke in riddles, their words layered with meaning. And if you failed to grasp the true intent, you risked playing into a trap that had been set months or even years in advance. The hunt for queens was rarely a single dramatic event. It was a slow tightening of the noose, a careful orchestration of small humiliations, subtle exclusions, and manufactured scandals designed to isolate you from your allies until you were defenseless. Once the machinery of your downfall began to move, it was almost impossible to stop. Allies would turn their faces away in public, unwilling to be tainted by your fall, while enemies would smile with feigned sympathy, already calculating how best to claim the spoils of your ruin. You might find your correspondence intercepted, your servants bribed to report your words, and your private chambers searched under the guise of protecting you. In some courts, poison was the favored weapon. Not because it was efficient, but because it allowed for plausible deniability, and unexpected illness could be explained away, your death mourned publicly while celebrated in private. In others, it was the legal machinery that became the blade, with charges of treason, adultery, or witchcraft serving as the official reason for your removal, no matter how fabricated the evidence. The deadliest part of being hunted was not the moment of capture, but the knowledge that the hunt had begun long before you realized it, that perhaps every smile you trusted and every promise you believed had been part of the game to bring you down. This was the reality for queens in ancient Europe, and surviving it required more than beauty. More than charm, it demanded a mastery of the invisible war fought in words, in gestures, in the silences between them, a war in which victory was never final, and defeat was always fatal. To understand why queens in ancient Europe were hunted with such precision, you must first step inside the architecture of power itself, a structure built not of stone and mortar, but of shifting allegiances, bloodlines, and ambition, sharpened into weapons. The throne was not merely a chair, it was a living organism, fed by the rivalries of noble families, the ambitions of foreign courts, and the quiet manipulations of those who could never hope to wear the crown themselves, yet sought to control it from the shadows. Queens, in this system, were paradoxes essential to the legitimacy of a dynasty, yet expendable when they threatened to tilt the balance. A queen was often a foreigner, her marriage the result of delicate negotiations between kingdoms meant to seal treaties, secure trade routes, or end wars. She arrived in her new realm carrying the customs, the language, and the expectations of her homeland, which to the native court could be both a source of fascination and a pretext for suspicion. From the moment she crossed the threshold of her husband's palace, her life became a series of performances in which she had to charm the nobility, produce heirs, and maintain her homeland's honor, all while navigating the invisible minefield of court politics. Every smile she offered, every ally she cultivated, every whisper she heard could be used against her. The most dangerous phase for a queen often began after she fulfilled her primary duty of producing an heir, for at that point she shifted from being an asset to a potential obstacle. If the king's affections wandered or if another noble family sought to elevate their daughter to the role, the existing queen's position became precarious. Political rivals would begin to gather evidence, real or fabricated, to undermine her reputation. A late-night conversation with an advisor could be painted as treasonous plotting. A gift from a foreign emissary could be twisted into proof of espionage. Even the natural misfortunes of life, miscarriage, illness, or the death of a child, could be recast as divine punishment for hidden sins. The process of the hunt was never abrupt. It began in murmurs, with subtle slights during ceremonies, the removal of her name from certain petitions, the absence of invitations to key councils. Then came the reshuffling of her household staff, placing loyal servants with spies loyal to her enemies. Her allies would find themselves reassigned to distant posts or entangled in scandals of their own, leaving her increasingly isolated. If she resisted these pressures, the accusations would grow bolder. In Protestant and Catholic courts alike, charges of heresy or witchcraft could strip a queen of her dignity and justify extreme measures. In more secular courts, the preferred charges were adultery or treason, both carrying the penalty of death. Consider the fate of Anne Boleyn in England Once Adored. She became the victim of a meticulously orchestrated campaign that combined political necessity with personal vengeance. Or think of Isabella of Angoulême in France, whose beauty and political influence made her a constant target for plots that sought to weaken her husband's reign. In each case, the hunt relied on the court's willingness to believe the worst. For in the public mind, a queen was never entirely innocent. Her proximity to power made her suspect by default. The endgame of such hunts varied. Some queens were sent to convents, where they would spend the rest of their lives in enforced piety, their existence a silent reminder of the court's power to remove those it no longer favored. Others were exiled to distant estates, their letters censored, their visitors monitored, their identities slowly erased from public memory. The most unfortunate met their ends on the scaffold, their executions staged as both justice and spectacle. A warning to all who might challenge the established order. What made the hunting of queens particularly insidious was that it operated under the guise of morality and law. Trials were staged with the appearance of fairness, evidence presented with solemn ceremony, verdicts delivered as though the outcome had not been predetermined from the start. The spectacle reassured the populace that order had been maintained, that justice had been served, even as it reinforced the underlying truth. In the hierarchy of ancient Europe, a queen's survival was conditional, her safety dependent on her ability to remain useful and unthreatening to the powers around her. In this game, there was no victory, only the delay of inevitable peril. To see the true cruelty behind the hunting of queens in ancient Europe, one must look beyond the polished veneer of royal portraits and ceremonial processions, into the corridors where whispers carried more weight than swords. These hunts were not always declared. They unfolded like a slow tightening of a noose, where each day brought another small deprivation, another subtle humiliation. The queen's apartments might be moved to a less prestigious wing of the palace, her jewels temporarily removed for inventory and never returned, her personal guards replaced by men loyal to her rivals. These were warnings disguised as protocol, the first signs that her standing was crumbling. She could not publicly object without appearing paranoid. Yet to remain silent allowed the erosion to continue unchecked. In Spain during the reign of certain Castilian monarchs, queens often found themselves accused of meddling too deeply in affairs of state. Even when their counsel was requested by the king in private, its public revelation could be weaponized by nobles who feared the rise of a foreign-born influence. Letters intercepted between a queen and her family abroad could be interpreted as proof of divided loyalties. In France, the Valois and Bourbon courts perfected the art of orchestrating these falls. From grace-lavish banquets and masked balls would be staged where the queen was conspicuously absent, her absence justified by claims of illness or piety. Yet everyone understood the message. She was being sidelined. The tactics were psychological as much as political. Isolation was the most effective weapon. Queens were social creatures by necessity, their survival dependent on alliances and the loyalty of courtiers. Once those bonds were severed, she became vulnerable. Courtiers who once hung on her every word would now bow politely and move on, unwilling to risk their own standing. The corridors that once echoed with her influence became silent when she passed, as if the palace itself was rehearsing her absence. In some courts, the final act was assassination disguised as misfortune. A sudden fever, a fall from a horse, an infection after childbirth. These could be natural tragedies, but they could also be the convenient outcomes of poison slipped into wine or herbs introduced into a physician's remedy. Because medicine in that era was as much superstition as science, such deaths could be mourned publicly without prompting too many questions. In Italy, the use of poison as a political tool was so refined that it became an art form. Certain families kept recipes passed down through generations, subtle enough to kill over weeks or months, leaving no clear cause for suspicion. Other queens faced fates designed to humiliate rather than kill. They might be forced into public confessions of sins they had not committed, their statements carefully scripted to bolster the reputation of those who orchestrated their downfall. In some German principalities, a deposed queen was paraded through the streets in plain dress, her hair cut short to signal her loss of status. This was both punishment and propaganda, a spectacle meant to reassure the populace that even the highest-born woman could be brought low if she challenged the order of things. Yet perhaps the most haunting aspect of these hunts was the complicity of the kings themselves. While some genuinely loved their queens and sought to protect them, many saw them as political assets to be traded, discarded, or replaced as circumstances demanded. The king might allow the campaign against his wife to proceed unchecked, knowing that her removal would appease powerful nobles or foreign allies. In certain cases, the king himself initiated the hunt, using the machinery of court politics to orchestrate her fall while maintaining the appearance of reluctant detachment. The public rarely saw the full brutality of these hunts, for they were wrapped in the language of duty, honor, and divine will. Chronicles recorded the official version of events, painting the queen as flawed, ambitious, or morally suspect, while omitting the careful engineering of her downfall. Plays and poems commissioned after her removal would reinforce these narratives, transforming her into a cautionary figure whose fate served as a warning to future queens. Step beyond the boundaries set for you, and you will be hunted. It was a system sustained by fear, by the understanding that no matter how beloved or influential a queen might be, she remained a guest in her own court. Her marriage was a contract, her crown a conditional privilege, and her safety contingent on her ability to navigate the shifting alliances around her. In the end, the hunt was not merely about removing a queen. It was about reinforcing the architecture of power, reminding everyone from the lowest page to the highest prince that no one was beyond reach. And so the cycle continued. Queen after queen, century after century, until the very notion of royal marriage carried within it the unspoken knowledge that love and loyalty were fragile, but danger was eternal. To understand the machinery behind the hunting of queens in ancient Europe, one must step into the great halls and narrow chambers where decisions were made not in shouts but in measured silences. It was in these spaces, away from the gaze of the public, that the fates of women crowned in gold were decided by men crowned in power. The queen might wake to the sound of the chapel bells and believe herself secure, yet by the time the last note faded, a plot against her could already be set in motion. Her influence was her greatest asset but also her greatest liability. For every alliance she forged, every promise she secured, made her a target for those who feared what she might become. In Burgundy, court records describe the fall of a queen whose only crime had been her skill at diplomacy. She had brought warring noble houses to the table, secured treaties that enriched the crown, and built a network of loyal courtiers. But these very successes drew suspicion. The duke's advisors whispered that she sought to rule in his place, that her correspondence with foreign envoys was proof of treason. Soon, her letters were intercepted, altered to incriminate her. When she protested, her words were twisted into further evidence of guilt. Her enemies did not need to prove her betrayal, they only needed to make it plausible. In England, the machinery was more theatrical. Public trials were staged not to discover truth, but to display the queen's supposed moral failing. Evidence might be invented, witnesses bribed or coerced, and the outcome decided before the first accusation was read. The people, drawn to spectacle, would gather outside the court, their shouts echoing in the streets. Inside, the queen would stand surrounded by hostile faces, her dignity intact but her fate already sealed. The verdict guilty of adultery, treason, witchcraft, or all three would be delivered with solemnity, as if justice had truly been served. France preferred a subtler approach. The royal court was a theater of manners where one could be destroyed without a single direct accusation. A queen might find her invitations to important councils quietly revoked. Her allies offered bribes or titles to abandon her. Rumors would drift through the salon, suggestions of improper relationships, questions about her lineage, doubts about her ability to bear heirs. These whispers would be repeated until they solidified into accepted truth. By the time the queen realized the extent of the campaign against her, her influence was gone, her position reduced to that of an ornament in the background of royal life. The methods varied, but the goal was the same: to neutralize the queen before she could threaten the balance of power. This was not merely a contest between individuals, but a clash of factions, each with its own ambitions. The queen's removal could shift the entire political landscape, opening opportunities for marriages, treaties, or wars. Her destruction was often calculated with the precision of a military campaign, each step executed with patience and skill. And yet, behind the cold strategy, there was often a personal element: jealousy, resentment, wounded pride. A queen who dared to speak too freely, who laughed at the wrong joke, who failed to show proper deference to a powerful noble, could ignite enmities that would one day consume her. Even a king's affection could turn to indifference, then to hostility, if he came to believe rightly or wrongly that his wife had betrayed him. In such cases, the political and the personal intertwined, making her downfall both inevitable and swift. The public face of these hunts was always carefully managed. Chroniclers wrote in the language of moral order, portraying the queen's removal as a necessary act to preserve the realm. Her virtues were forgotten, her faults magnified. Future generations would know her not as she truly was, but as the figure her enemies had crafted, an example of what happens when a queen oversteps her bounds. In truth, many of these women were guilty only of being effective, intelligent, and unwilling to be silent. That was enough to make them dangerous. In this way, the hunting of queens became a recurring ritual in the life of monarchies, as predictable as coronations or funerals. Each downfall reinforced the message to the next queen: your beauty, your wit, your alliances, all are temporary. The crown may rest on your head today, but it can just as easily become the weight that drags you under tomorrow. In the winter of 1477, the court of Burgundy moved into the great fortress of Dijon, its halls heavy with the scent of burning cedar and the murmur of calculated conversations. The queen walked those halls draped in ermine and silk, her every step followed not only by ladies-in-waiting but by the invisible presence of suspicion. Outside the thick walls, snow muffled the world, but inside, the air was sharp with politics. She had spent years weaving a web of alliances between Burgundy, France, and the Low Countries, each knot tied with letters, dowries, and feasts that bound powerful families to her cause. She believed her position secure, but the very threads she had spun began to tighten into a noose. Her rivals were patient. They began by eroding her image, planting doubts in the mind of the Duke. The first was a simple suggestion that she had been seen meeting alone with a foreign envoy. Then came the forged letter, inked in a hand so similar to hers that even her most loyal clerk hesitated before denying it. In the letter, she supposedly promised aid to a rival claimant in exchange for military support. The Duke, already burdened by the pressures of war, found the seed of doubt growing in his mind. Soon, the Queen's requests for funds to support her charitable works were denied, her influence in council quietly reduced. She felt the shift in the air during a feast held for the Feast of Epiphany. In previous years, she had been seated beside the Duke, her goblet filled by his own hand. That night, she was placed 2 seats away, the space between them filled by a nobleman who had once begged for her favor but now barely inclined his head in greeting. The music played, the torches burned bright, yet the coldness was unmistakable. Beyond Burgundy, other courts carried out similar hunts in their own way. In Castile, Queen Joanna of Navarre found herself accused not of treason, but of witchcraft. The charge was convenient witchcraft, required no tangible proof, only fear and rumor. Priests preached from pulpits about her supposed consorting with spirits, claiming that her sleepless nights were evidence of nocturnal pacts. In truth, her insomnia was born of grief after the death of her child, but grief was not a defense that could save her. Within months, she was moved to a secluded stronghold, where her only company came from the guards who brought her food and the sound of wind slipping through cracks in the stone walls, and the act of removing queens was rarely presented as punishment. It was framed as a necessity, a way to weaken influence without starting open. Conflict striking at a queen could unsettle a king, break alliances, and create space for new powers to rise, and the removal was both a sign to others and a door for rivals to walk through. The means of doing this were often polished in appearance, but deeply damaging in effect. Direct harm was uncommon, yet harm to reputation through whispers, isolation, and carefully shaped stories was frequent. Once her public image could no longer recover, her path was shaped without a sword being drawn. She might be sent to a religious house under the pretense of devotion, or to a far estate for supposed rest, or kept inside her rooms for an indefinite span. Those guiding these outcomes avoided written proof. Instructions were spoken, witnesses chosen for their loyalty or caution, and records made the change seem voluntary or blessed by hire, while the real story faded into gaps between official lines surviving only in quiet talk and the guarded notes of those who once served her beyond palace walls. The change appeared sudden, but inside it was the result of a slow series of steps, every cool look each canceled audience, each intercepted message, drew her closer to the end, and when the conclusion came, whether as an accusation or a silent transfer, it met with quiet acknowledgement from those who understood this was the way influence shifted. There were moments when a queen refused to yield, when, instead of falling into the design, she turned to meet it with precision. Such boldness carried risks for. In the great courts of Europe, challenging the tide could bring consequences far heavier than departure. But for some, the thought of silence was harder still. In France during the late 14th century, Isabeau of Bavaria faced a campaign to remove her. Standing rumors cast her as wasteful, distant from her people, and draining the treasury. Yet she understood the nature of the contest and began to answer it. She formed bonds with care, using gifts and promises her opponents could not match. She made deliberate public appearances, walking beside the king in processions, giving bread to the hungry, bowing before treasured relics, greeting influential guild leaders warmly. These were acts shaped to build support outside palace walls, making it harder for her rivals to act without public disapproval. For a while, it worked. Merchants spoke in her favor, and the people questioned the tales carried in markets and gathering places. But such gains were fragile. Her rivals adjusted, drawing the matter into the king's private rooms. They stirred his doubts, his concerns about his health, his worry that she aimed to guide the realm after him. They painted her moves as steps toward taking power, warning that her influence would remain and threaten his legacy. And slowly the distance between them grew until the court's coldness returned elsewhere. Resistance was more direct in Hungary. Elizabeth of Luxembourg faced claims of ordering political killings instead of stepping back. She called for an open council to meet her accusers. Before the gathered nobility, she addressed each charge with facts and witness accounts revealing flaws in the claims. And for a brief moment, it seemed she had turned the tide. But such moments rarely lasted. Within 2 years, the same charges reappeared, altered in detail, and now supported by outside envoys promised reward for her displacement. Queens who resisted did so. Knowing the odds were slim, they fought not only to win, but to force their opponents into the open, to show the true nature of their intent. Sometimes this shamed an adversary into stopping. More often, it simply delayed what was coming. Yet, even a delay could protect children, secure resources, or keep an ally safe. And what made this defiance striking was that it happened in a world arranged to prevent it. Every gesture, every word spoken by a queen was scrutinized, weighed for advantage or danger. A single misstep could be spun into treachery, and a moment of anger could be written down as proof of madness or moral corruption. To resist in such a climate required not only courage but a mastery of subtlety, the ability to say nothing while seeming to say much, to act without leaving a trace, to smile at one's enemies while memorizing the patterns of their moves. These queens were not remembered in official chronicles as heroes. The records, often written by those loyal to their rivals, painted them as obstinate, prideful, or manipulative. Yet in the shadows of history, in the letters hidden in archives and the stories passed down in whispers, they survive as women who dared to play a game they were never meant to win, who held their ground against the hunt long enough to remind the world that even in the most gilded cages, a queen could still bare her teeth. When the hunt for a queen shifted from the court to the pulpit, the game changed entirely. For once religion was invoked, no amount of political maneuvering could guarantee survival. In the Europe of the late Middle Ages, the church was not merely a spiritual authority. It was a force that could crown kings, excommunicate rulers, and turn entire kingdoms against their sovereigns. For a queen to fall under the suspicion of heresy, blasphemy, or even excessive influence over religious affairs was to step into a storm from which few returned. Unlike the subtle court intrigues that unfolded behind velvet curtains, religious hunts were public, ritualized, and often brutal. The accusation alone carried the weight of divine judgment, and in a deeply pious society, to be marked as ungodly was to be marked for destruction. One of the earliest and most infamous examples was that of Joanna of Naples in the 14th century. She was accused not only of political crimes, but of moral and spiritual corruption. Her enemies framed her as a queen who had abandoned the virtues of a Christian monarch, claiming she had consorted with sorcerers, ignored holy feast days, and defied papal authority. These charges, repeated from pulpits and woven into sermons, seeped into the minds of her subjects. By the time she attempted to defend herself, the damage was done. The people saw her not as a ruler in conflict with Rome, but as a threat to their own salvation. Religious hunts were particularly dangerous because they erased the distinction between sin and politics. In Castile, Queen Blanche of Bourbon found herself accused of being cold and distant toward her husband, King Peter, a charge that might have remained a personal grievance. But the court chaplains reframed her behavior as evidence of a disordered, unnatural spirit, an affront to the sacred institution of marriage, which they declared a reflection of Christ and the Church. Suddenly, a marital dispute became a theological offense, and the whispers of annulment grew into open calls for her removal, couched in the language of divine necessity. In France, the influence of the Church meant that even queens with strong political networks could be undone by spiritual accusations. Margaret of Burgundy, wife to King Louis X, was implicated in the infamous Tour de Nesle affair, a scandal that involved accusations of adultery among royal women. Though the political dimension of the charges was obvious, the Church's intervention transformed the trial into a moral reckoning. Adultery, they argued, was not merely a personal failing, but a corruption of the royal bloodline and a sin that polluted the very soul of the nation. Her punishment, public penance, and imprisonment was staged not as the will of the king, but as the will of God, making resistance all but impossible. What made these religious hunts so effective was their appeal to fear. A courtier could be bribed, a council swayed, a monarch persuaded, but a soul could not be ransomed once the Church declared it damned. The sermons against a queen were crafted with care, weaving biblical imagery into political narrative until the two became inseparable. She was not merely an ambitious woman. She was Jezebel, Delilah, or Eve, names heavy with centuries of condemnation. The allegory was intentional. Placing her among figures from Scripture seen as corrupt ensured that speaking against her could be framed as devotion to faith, and the public nature of religious judgment served as a warning to others. The fall of a queen was staged, so that every noblewoman, every wife with ambition, every woman active in politics would recognize the limits of her reach in public penance. The queen might be clothed in simple garments, without jewels, walking barefoot through the streets, while prayers were spoken for her soul. These actions were not meant to end her life at once, but to remove her honor, turning her from a figure of authority into a cautionary example. Yet there were moments when this same stage could be turned against those directing it. Some queens, well read in Scripture and able to speak with skill, answered their accusers not with silence, but with words drawn from the same texts, defending their conduct in rare cases. This gained enough support from clergy to delay their fall or even restore their standing, though such outcomes were uncommon, and suspicion often followed them for the rest of their lives. When a queen stood at the center of conflict between political and religious powers, the risk increased, for she was judged not simply as herself, but as the symbol of a greater struggle in the Holy Roman Empire, where rulers and church leaders balanced authority. A queen who supported one side too clearly risked being shown as opposing divine order. Elizabeth of Luxembourg, consort to Albert II, faced this when she resisted the growth of certain bishoprics that threatened her family's claims. Her political stance was recast as opposition to the Church's mission. The claims spread first in private church meetings, then in sermons, until she was seen not as a faithful believer, but as a worldly figure, placing family gain above spiritual duty. In England, during disputes between Crown and Rome, queens could be caught in the middle. Catherine of Aragon's refusal to accept an annulment from her husband became both a personal and religious trial. Her supporters saw her as steadfast in faith, her opponents as unwilling to accept God's will. Preachers were divided. Some honored her as virtuous. Others described her as an obstacle to divine purpose. Every act and statement she made became a point of doctrine, influencing the future of the realm. When ambition and religion joined, it created a weapon that framed opposition to the queen as defense of the nation's soul. In France, during the civil strife between Armagnacs and Burgundians, the alliances of Isabeau of Bavaria were recast as moral failing. Writings accused her of turning to forbidden advisors and harming the king's judgment. Sermons called her a source of corruption, and once such views took root, even acts of generosity were painted as false displays aimed to hide wrongdoing. Religious campaigns against queens did not begin suddenly. They were built over time by steady defamation, sometimes with church figures acting for political allies, using influence over the people to turn doubt into certainty. Scripture was quoted, selectively linking stories of dangerous women or false teachers to the queen's alleged faults. Until the idea felt complete to the public, the conclusion was obvious. She was guilty because those seen as holy declared it, and such voices were rarely questioned. This merging of sacred authority and political intent left a queen with no safe choice. Defending herself could be taken as defiance to faith, and silence allowed the claims to grow unchecked. When trials occurred, they seldom met standards of fairness. Church courts followed different rules, allowing rumor and interpretation to outweigh proof. A queen could be called to swear on relics or respond to charges shaped entirely by theological reading. Are questions designed less to uncover truth than to entrap her in contradictions. The judges, often clerics loyal to her political rivals, cloaked their verdicts in the language of salvation, declaring that their sentence was for the good of her soul, even if it meant stripping her of crown, freedom, or life. And when the sentence was carried out, whether through enforced cloistering, exile, or execution, it was done under the solemn tolling of bells, as though the kingdom itself were participating in a sacred rite. In such moments, the queen ceased to be merely a political casualty. She became a symbol in a morality play staged for the benefit of both throne and altar. Her humiliation served to remind the people of the dangers of pride, ambition, and disobedience to God's will, at least as interpreted by those in power. The real lesson, however, was far more chilling. In ancient Europe, no queen, however pious, was beyond the reach of a hunt sanctioned in the name of heaven, and once the church's voice joined the chorus against her, the verdict was almost always foregone. When the machinery of accusation reached its peak, the hunt for a queen became something akin to a public festival of condemnation, a carefully orchestrated drama, in which the outcome was known long before the first witness was called. In the late 16th century, Mary, Queen of Scots, stood as the perfect embodiment of how religion, politics, and fear could combine into a sentence no mortal could evade. She was not merely a Catholic in a Protestant realm, she was a living rallying point for rebellion, a woman whose very existence challenged the legitimacy of Elizabeth I's throne. Her imprisonment was framed not as an act of political containment, but as a necessary step to protect the faith of the kingdom. Yet as the years passed, her continued survival became intolerable to those who feared her influence, and so the web of charges was woven tighter, each thread drawn from intercepted letters, coerced confessions, and the fevered imaginations of those convinced they were saving England's soul. By the time she was brought to trial, the verdict was not in question, only the form it would take. The spectacle of Mary's execution was crafted with precision. Her red petticoat, revealed beneath the gown as she disrobed, was interpreted as a sign of martyrdom by her supporters and as defiant provocation by her enemies. The executioner's axe was not merely a tool of death, it was a symbol, the final stroke in a narrative that painted her as both dangerous and defeated. The moment her head fell, the crowd was not simply witnessing justice. They were witnessing a ritual cleansing, a symbolic severing of a threat that had loomed over the realm for decades. But not all hunts ended in open execution. Some queens were erased in quieter, more insidious ways, their lives extinguished without the noise of the scaffold. In the German states, when Duchess Renata of Lorraine was accused of secretly abetting Protestant conspiracies, she was not tried in public but confined to a remote castle, her correspondence cut off, her attendants replaced by spies loyal to her accusers. She disappeared from court life as though she had never existed, her name spoken only in whispers, her fate a warning that one could be destroyed not just by the blade, but by the slow suffocation of isolation. To the public, there was no scandal, only the vague understanding that she had somehow offended God and prince alike. This erasure could be even more effective than execution. A beheading made a martyr, an exile created a ghost. Queens who vanished into cloisters or distant fortresses became legends, their stories reshaped by rumor until they bore little resemblance to truth. For rulers, this was a perfect solution. The threat was neutralized, yet the stain of public bloodshed was avoided. And in the minds of the people, the lesson was still clear: step beyond the bounds of what church and crown defined as acceptable, and you too could be unmade. What made these hunts so enduring was the way they intertwined morality with survival. A queen was judged not solely on her actions, but on the perception of those actions, and perception could be molded at will. A charitable donation to a monastery could be spun as an attempt to buy influence with the clergy. A meeting with a foreign envoy could be painted as treason. Even silence, in the face of accusation, could be framed as proof of guilt. And because the hunts often drew upon genuine fears of heresy, of foreign invasion, of divine punishment, they resonated with the populace. It was not merely a handful of courtiers or bishops condemning the queen. It was an entire culture, primed to believe that a woman's ambition, if left unchecked, could bring ruin upon the realm. In the end, the fate of hunted queens in ancient Europe was sealed by a single truth. Once the narrative was fixed, it did not matter whether the charges were real or fabricated. Trials were stages, verdicts were scripts, and the queen herself was both actor and victim in a performance designed for the consumption of the masses. Her fall was not an accident. It was the climax of a story carefully told. A story in which the conclusion was always the same. The throne might survive. The church might claim victory. But the queen would vanish. Her voice silenced. Her name forever marked by the hunt. And so the cycle continued, generation after generation, until the memory of these women became less about who they truly were and more about the cautionary tales their enemies had written for them. When the dust settled after the fall of a hunted queen, the court did not return to normal. The corridors that had once echoed with her footsteps, her laughter, the rustle of her gowns, now carried a hollow stillness. Servants learned to lower their voices when speaking her name, and in time, they stopped speaking it at all. The apartments she had occupied might be reassigned to a lesser noblewoman or closed entirely, the furniture left untouched, as though the air itself were poisoned. This silence was not merely grief, it was an act of erasure, a deliberate removal of her presence from the living memory of the palace. For those who had served her loyally, this was a quiet torment. They had seen her as a human being, not just a figure on a throne. And to watch her transformed into a villain in official records was to witness a second death, one that could not be avenged. The aftermath of such hunts was not limited to the palace walls. Across the towns and villages of the realm, word of the queen's downfall was carried by royal proclamations, sermons from pulpits, and the whispers of travelers. In every telling, the story shifted, growing more dramatic with each retelling. A queen who had merely written to her cousin in a foreign court became, in rumor, a conspirator plotting invasion. A queen who had spoken against a bishop became, in memory, a witch invoking pagan rites. This was not just gossip, it was a form of cultural control, shaping how the populace would remember not only the queen herself, but the very idea of female power. Over time, this rewriting of history had a chilling effect on the women who would follow. New queens arrived in courts where their predecessors' portraits had been removed or defaced, where every gesture was weighed for signs of disloyalty, where their most trusted ladies-in-waiting might be loyal to the king rather than to them. They learned quickly that survival depended on invisibility. Public charity was carefully measured so as not to appear ostentatious. Private correspondence was limited to avoid suspicion. Friendships were cultivated with caution, for today's confidant could be tomorrow's accuser. Queens became adept at the art of existing without leaving a trace as skill as necessary to their survival as political acumen or charm. Yet this caution came at a cost. Queens who lived in constant fear of the hunt could not act as patrons of the arts, could not advance policies, could not use their influence for the betterment of their people without risking the same fate as those who had fallen before them. This suffocating restraint dimmed the cultural and political contributions of countless royal women, robbing history of what they might have achieved had they been allowed to act freely. In some courts, the queen became little more than a ceremonial figure, paraded at festivals and feasts but otherwise kept from the levers of power. The psychological toll was equally severe. To live under the shadow of the hunt was to internalize its threat, to see oneself always through the eyes of one's enemies. Paranoia became second nature. Queens scrutinized their own words before speaking, rehearsed every movement in the mirror to ensure no expression could be misinterpreted. They learned to smile when they wished to scream, to appear serene when their hearts raced with dread. Some found ways to endure, pouring their energy into motherhood, into quiet acts of kindness that left no record. Others withdrew entirely, finding refuge in religion or illness, retreating to the safety of bedchambers and chapels. What the hunts left behind, above all, was a precedent. Once the mechanism for removing a queen had been perfected, it could be revived at will. In times of political instability, a mere whisper of disloyalty or heresy could begin the process anew. The people, having seen it happen before, needed little convincing. The court, trained by generations of purges, knew its role in the drama. And so the cycle endured, not because every queen was guilty, but because the machinery of suspicion had become part of governance itself. In this way, the hunt for queens in ancient Europe was not merely a series of isolated tragedies, it was an institution, one as real and enduring as the monarchy it served. It kept power concentrated, silenced dissent, and reminded every woman who wore a crow on that she did so not by right, but by the fragile grace of forces that could turn against her at any moment. And in the whispered recollections of those who dared remember, the question lingered. How many of these women had truly been threats, and how many had simply been too visible in a world that preferred its queens silent? If the immediate aftermath of a queen's downfall was silence, the long-term effect was something far more insidious, a slow reshaping of dynastic politics, where the role of a queen was deliberately hollowed out across generations. In the decades following the first high-profile hunts, royal councils began to codify new rules of behavior for consorts. Some were written plainly into law restrictions on travel without royal permission, requirements that every letter a queen sent be copied into official archives, the appointment of overseers whose sole purpose was to monitor her correspondence and visitors. Others were unspoken, but equally binding: never appear at court without the king's escort, never receive foreign emissaries alone, never allow personal favorites to rise too quickly in influence. These measures were framed as protections for the queen, but in truth, they were chains meant to keep her from ever becoming powerful enough to challenge the king's will. Over time, young princesses raised for marriage into such courts learned these rules before they ever set foot on foreign soil. Their tutors, their mothers, even the older ladies-in-waiting would drill them in the art of avoiding suspicion. Speak well of your husband at all times, even when he is absent, they were told. Make no sudden changes in your household. Such changes will be read as plots. If you have enemies, outlast them by making yourself too harmless to destroy. These instructions were passed down not out of loyalty to the crown, but as survival strategies. They were the quiet inheritance of a world in which a queen could be hunted as easily as a stag in the royal forest. The ripple effects were not limited to the palace. Nobility across the realm understood that aligning too closely with a queen could be dangerous. A duke who once might have sought her patronage for his cause now thought twice, calculating whether her fall would drag him down with her. Artists, poets, and scholars who might have flourished under her patronage instead turned to male patrons, ensuring that the queen's cultural influence dwindled to near invisibility. Even the church, which had once courted queens as pious benefactors, began to treat them with caution, wary of being tainted by association should the tides turn against them. And yet, despite all these constraints, there were moments brief, glimmering when queens managed to navigate the treacherous terrain. Some wielded their influence through their children, shaping the next generation of rulers. Others forged alliances among the women of the court, building informal networks of power that could not easily be dismantled. A few turned to the very tools used against them: rumor, performance, and careful manipulation of public image to secure their survival. These women became legends in their own right, remembered not for their public triumphs, but for the subtlety with which they endured in a hostile world. But such survival came with compromises that left their mark on the monarchy itself. The role of the queen was transformed from that of an active political partner to that of a symbolic ornament, visible, admired, but stripped of agency. This shift reinforced the patriarchal structure of the monarchy, ensuring that even when a king was weak, the queen could not rise to fill the gap without triggering the very machinery that had destroyed her predecessors. It also meant that when crises arose, famine, war, Rebellion, the queen's voice, was absent from the councils that might have benefited from her perspective. In this way, the hunt for queens weakened not only the women themselves, but the stability of the kingdoms they served. The memory of past hunts lingered in the architecture of palaces and in the unwritten rules of court etiquette. Visitors might notice an unused wing, locked for decades, where a disgraced queen had once lived. They might hear an old servant refer to a particular staircase as the Queen's Descent, without explanation. These were ghostly reminders of a system that erased women without ever admitting their erasure. The lesson was clear. The Queen's crown was not a shield, but a target, gleaming only so long as it reflected the king's glory. In this climate, even the rare queens who escaped the hunt entirely did so under constant watch. Their every kindness could be twisted into favoritism, their every alliance into conspiracy. They learned to wield invisibility like a blade, cutting away any action that might draw too much attention. And while this allowed some to live long, peaceful lives, it also meant that their reigns left little trace in the chronicles of history, a silence that was itself a victory for those who preferred a queen's legacy to vanish with her. Thus, by the time the 17th century approached, the hunt for queens had become less an event and more a condition, a quiet, ever-present tension that shaped the very definition of queenship. It was no longer necessary to accuse or execute. The fear of accusation was enough to keep most queens firmly in place. Their ambitions clipped before they could bloom. This was the true legacy of the hunts. Not the destruction of a few extraordinary women, but the lasting curtailment of what any queen might dare to become. The story of why queens were hunted in ancient Europe is not only a record of individual tragedies, it is the anatomy of a system designed to police the boundaries of female power with ruthless precision. From its earliest instances, the hunt was both political theater and a practical purge, a warning to all who might imagine a queen as a true sovereign rather than a ceremonial figure. It thrived on the paradox that the queen was indispensable yet disposable, needed to legitimize the dynasty, to bear heirs, to embody the crown's moral image, yet always vulnerable to removal if her presence threatened the stability of male authority. This paradox was the beating heart of the hunts, and it ensured their survival long after the original bloodshed had faded from memory. In the early centuries, when accusations were blunt and punishments public, the hunt served as a spectacle, a lesson carved into the minds of the nobility and commoners alike. Crowds would gather to witness the public shaming or execution of a queen, not simply out of morbid curiosity, but because such events were staged as moral reckonings. Official proclamations framed them as divine justice, purging corruption from the heart of the realm. In truth, these performances masked the raw political calculus at play. Removing a queen removed a faction, silenced a network, shifted the balance of alliances within the kingdom. The morality was a mask, the power struggle was the face beneath. As the centuries turned, the process became subtler. Physical violence was replaced with social death. Where once queens might have been led to the scaffold, they were now led to isolated estates, to cloisters far from the capital, to endless illnesses that kept them from court. The public hunger for blood was replaced by an appetite for rumor whispers about poison, treachery, adultery, circulated not to destroy immediately, but to keep the queen in a state of perpetual defense, too busy fending off shadows to build real influence. These invisible chains proved just as binding as iron and in many ways more effective, for they left no martyr's grave, no moment of defiance to inspire future resistance. What made the hunts so enduring was their adaptability. They could be justified by religion casting the queen as a moral corrupter. They could be justified by politics accusing her of foreign allegiances. They could be justified by economics framing her household as a drain on the treasury. Whatever the context, the accusation always served the same purpose: to remind the court and the queen herself that her survival depended on being useful to the right people and harmless to everyone else. This constant recalibration of justifications allowed the hunt to outlive changes in dynasty, faith, and law. By the dawn of the modern era, the legacy of these hunts was so deeply woven into the monarchy's fabric that it no longer needed to be spoken aloud. Queens entered their roles, knowing the boundaries without being told. Their lives shaped by the unspoken history of those who had come before. They learned the choreography of survival, the careful smile in public, the calculated distance from political factions, the cultivation of virtues that could be displayed but never wielded. Even their patronage, once a sphere of genuine influence, became carefully managed, funneled into safe causes that reinforced rather the and challenged the structures that kept them in check. And yet, there is a certain resilience in this history. For every queen erased, there were others who endured, not by defying the rules head-on, but by bending them until they became pathways to quiet influence. They learned to move in the spaces between scrutiny, to use the perception of harmlessness as a shield. In doing so, they preserved not only themselves but also fragments of the female voice in a political world determined to silence it. These women may not have rewritten laws or commanded armies, but they shaped court culture, steered royal succession, and left legacies that, while subtle, still ripple through history. The tragedy is that such cunning was required at all, that the role of queen, which could have been a partnership in governance, was instead treated as a dangerous anomaly to be managed, monitored, or eliminated. The hunt for queens was never truly about individual guilt or innocence. It was about the fear of what might happen if a woman at the heart of the throne wielded her position to its fullest extent. That fear, more than any law or accusation, was the weapon that kept the crown tilted in one direction. Today, when we look back on the queens of ancient Europe, it is tempting to remember only the glittering portraits, the ceremonial robes, the image of serene majesty. But behind every painting lies the shadow of the hunt, an unspoken truth that these women lived under a constant, invisible trial, their every gesture weighed, their every word measured against an unyielding standard. And in that knowledge lies the real history, not of thrones and crowns, but of the narrow ledge upon which power allowed them to walk, and the abyss that waited the moment they slipped.